Now I have no idea who Duane was, but apparently he had a fairly interesting story that will likely never be expanded upon. It's a shame we'll never learn the backstory of the cat that wandered in. Dark Knight Duane's Trustmaster reward is a helm. With nice HP, nice attack, and defense that exists, this Trustmaster reward will give this Duane only 500 extra attack. It is of course great for Duane, but its value for anyone else really depends on their current status and inventory. His Super Trustmaster reward is a sort of pretty good attack. As you might expect, it further gives Duane 500 extra attack if he's the one carrying it, but unfortunately the effect isn't stackable even if you hold two of the same swords. It does pack a triple killer though, strong against beasts, dragons, and stones, which is a nice addition for any weapon. Furthermore, True Byoga Blade. The poison's the only thing that links it with Byoga, as the ability itself chains with Extreme Nova while partially ignoring the enemy's defense. The modifier isn't particularly great though I guess it depends on your measure of reference. As far as Duane's kit goes, it's not any stronger than a triple casted attack. Still, the flexible chaining could be cool. Onto his active abilities. Oath of Daybreak inflicts a 135% fire imperil, imbues fire onto Duane, boosts his fire damage by 60%, and sets himself on fire. Oath of Twilight inflicts a 120% dark imperil, imbues dark onto Duane, boosts his dark damage by 45%, and he stabs his eyes out. Gently. Power Ravage inflicts a 80% attack break, deals self-chaining damage that chains with Bolting Strike and scares with Morale, and fills Duane's limit burst gauge by 1/3. Magic Ravage is the same thing but inflicts a magic break, and chains with Stardust Ray. Armor Ravage is the same thing but defense break, and chains with Absolute Mirror of Equity. Stalwart Mantle gives Duane a 60% physical mitigation buff, an additional mitigation buff at the same level against beasts, dragons, and stone enemies, fills his limit burst gauge by 1/3, and for some reason hurts himself to do so. Arcane Mantle is the same thing, but defends against magic attacks. Blood Shield will turn Duane's blood into a shield, boosting Duane's fire and dark resistance by 100%, gives him an impressive 90% general mitigation buff, fills his limit burst gauge by 2/3, but he also bleeds out. Somehow, this fills the morale gauge. Hellfire Infusion can be used once per battle. It boosts Duane's limit burst damage, his fire damage by 150%, fills his limit burst gauge by 2/3, and fills the morale gauge. Atonement and Absolution deals damage that partially ignores the enemy's defense, and self-chains with a triple-casted Absolute Mirror of Equity. However, because of this, it can't be multi-casted with anything. Passives. With his Trustmaster reward or Super Trustmaster reward equipped, Duane gains additional attack while carrying his sword, extra limit burst damage, 6 strong killers, and 2 extra abilities. The first, Arcane Supplementation, is usable with Morale Advantage. It boosts your team's stats by a whopping 450%, their limit burst damage by 350%, lets them evade 3 attacks, removes any breaks, and fills the morale gauge. The second changes his normal attack to Arcane Negation, which removes enemy buffs and fills Duane's limit burst gauge by 1/6. He really wants that passive, given that this box is pretty empty without it. He does have a nifty boost to his physical evasion though. He prefers to carry 2 weapons, meaning the foe capped at a chain limit boost, and the 200 extra that was one of Stripper's selling points. He also packs 2 Guts buffs, a nifty passive when combined with his ability to self-buff as he's dying. When his HP falls below 80%, Duane will automatically boost his attack and defense by 300%, while giving him resistance to those breaks. When his HP hits 30% or below, he'll automatically give himself a HP barrier, a EX plus 3 killer buff against all species, maybe, probably, wow that's a pain to read, and a permanent HP regen. At EX plus 2 he gets Power Through Darkness. This gives him 750 more attack, and a Warring Spirit of Morale attached. At EX plus 3 he gets Paragon of Darkness. This not only gives him 500 attack, but extra HP. He'll also get a morale regen every turn. His elemental resistance is also really good, even though he's got no defenses against his greatest foe, himself. Let's look at his limit burst. It inflicts a 35% sword imperil, and deals self-chaining damage that scares with morale. As a super limit burst user, Dark Knight Duane has access to attack shift, which automatically boosts his attack by 250%, his limit burst damage by 200%, and fills his limit burst gauge when the super limit burst is ready to go. The super limit burst will let Duane evade 6 attacks, boost the damage modifier of his base limit burst, gives him an HP regen, and recharges Atonement and Absolution. Time to talk about leader skills. Duane's leader skill will affect units tagged Clash of Wills, boosting their attack, defense, magic, and spirit by 300%. More on that later. Let's rank Brave abilities. Both are pretty good. I'd prioritize Dark Arcane Swordsmanship to further raise his passives and make him easier to build, and then Hellfire Infusion to raise the Limit Burst damage buff and further fill the morale gauge. Time to make a damage rotation. On turn 1, set himself on fire, use his Blood as a shield, and cast Armor Ravage. On turn 2, use his Limit Burst. On turn 3, cast Hellfire Infusion and double cast Armor Ravage. On turn 4, cast Atonement and Absolution. On turn 5, use his Super Limit Burst. Repeat the rotation from here. If you're using him in a fight with morale, then his Limit Burst can be the stronger tool depending on your morale, and thus you should reserve Hellfire Infusion for that instead. So, EX2. As a Super Limit Burst user, Duane automatically benefits from additional EX Awakenings. This is pretty important if you want to get the best damage out fast, given that his Super Limit Burst not only strengthens his base Limit Burst, but also lets him use Atonement and Absolution again. EX plus 2 also gives him Warring Spear with additional stats. The latter is more preferable, given that Duane has excellent setup moves he'll probably want to use first, though of course there's a lot of potential use from a turn 1 Sword Impero and self-chaining hits. EX plus 3 is more stats, a morale regen, and regenerates that hoe draining your Lapis count. How strange. So how good is Dark Knight Duane? Well, he's a new damage dealer, and global original at that, so as you might expect he is very strong. Despite appearing to have lowish damage modifiers and decentish stats, Duane can make up for this by copying Rain's extra chain cap. Speaking of his passes, they're pretty amazing, which is necessary else Duane would be crippled by the usual defensive requirements that could cut into his damage. Combine this with his self-chaining, debuffs, and his ability to give himself EX plus 3 killers if his HP drops, Duane carries himself as a powerful damage dealer, who probably works better as a sub option. This isn't really Duane's fault, it's just that since he already has his own forms of the typical buffs he might apply, it's probably better to use them on someone who doesn't, so that way you can bring in a souped up damage dealer and Duane. Speaking of support, morale. Well, not really morale, but just the ability available with morale. Arcane Supplementation. No one in the game matches Duane's level of stat buffs, and the ability also comes with evasion stacks and break removal, which is just icing on the cake. However, I have heard that apparently Duane can't cast this with anything. I don't have Duane so I can't test this, and I don't see anything that implies he can't do so, but just in case that's true, it is a pretty significant thing I'd hope someone can confirm. It's not too big a deal if you're using it to support the rest of your team, but the thing is Duane wouldn't be able to use that Limit Burst buff with an optimized rotation. After all, given his buffs last 3 turns or less, that means you need to decide between his Super Limit Burst, his Magnus Burst, and Arcane Supplementation, and you can't do all 3 before one of them wears off. But given that Duane is pretty powerful without Arcane Supplementation, it's not a terrible drawback. Furthermore, it's simplified if his Magnus Burst is used up without the enemy's death, and can also just be used to support other damage dealers. However, that also kind of brings us to the end of his support. Duane's abilities are selfish. They're good, but they're selfish. Duane is ultimately a good unit by virtue of being new. Self-chaining is a very powerful tool that can also be artificially generated by giving 2 support units chaining abilities instead, a potentially better option if you take Duane's non-support into account. Nevertheless, Duane has something most support units don't have: considerable damage. Ultimately, what's best will depend on the fight, but strictly speaking, all things considered, Duane's not a bad unit at all. Still, when we get to gameplay, it's always uncomfortable when the Super Limit Burst is a setup move. But what about his leader skill? 300% isn't as great as 500%, but in Duane's case we're comparing a non-premium with a premium, which is a much more understandable comparison than Last Worm. However, Duane only affects units tagged Clash of Wills. This isn't too big an issue, given that most Clash of Wills units are amazing, and a rather considerable boon when you think of the Clash of Wills units that don't belong to the Final Fantasy Brave Exvius game. It's also a better option for defensive damage dealers like Lilith, but of course I just name-dropped a season-limited unit, and you're probably bringing more conventional damage dealers anyways. Ultimately, being a cheaper option with a much better leader skill is a positive for Duane, but whether it's a positive for you will certainly depend on what you've got. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below if you summon Dark Knight Duane. Personally speaking, I'm not particularly interested. I don't know who Duane is. I didn't really see the appeal of the sprite, though the War of Divisions art looks really good. And I don't take the competitive aspect of the game seriously enough to go after big new stat buffs locked to generally competitive formats. It doesn't help that he's pretty much a damage dealer, the one oversaturated row that I don't need more of. Also, yeah, I do have Rain. Despite all that, I'd be happy to get him off banner. Not that that's been happening recently.